Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming along to our webinar today, Fixing Federal Nature Spending, Changing Government Investments from Harming to Helping. It's fantastic to have you all here today and our fantastic panel as well. I'm Brendan Wintle. I'm the Director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute at the University of Melbourne and also lead counsellor on the Biodiversity Council. So really proud and happy to be wearing my Biodiversity Council hat today. The Biodiversity Council is an independent expert group. It was formed by 11 Australian universities with the support of the Ian Potter Foundation and lots of other fantastic supporters. And we're here to promote evidence-based solutions to Australia's biodiversity crisis and bring power and determination to cultural leaders, Indigenous leaders across the country to care for country. On that note, I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting here on Yatmatang and Dudorowa country today. I'd also like to recognise that the Biodiversity Council acknowledges First Peoples lands, waters of Australia. I'd like to pay future and express gratitude for the long and ongoing custodianship of country that's left us with this incredible natural and cultural heritage and legacy that we are really struggling to look after since colonisation, theft and dispossession. So please put into the Q&A the country where you're sitting today, and I think we'll get cracking on with our topic of the day. So, changing in government investment from harming to helping. This is a really critical theme for the Biodiversity Council, something that we've been working on for a couple of years now, and it's a really critical issue for us to get right as a nation. As we all know, nature is rapidly declining here in Australia, and that threatens culture, food security, water quality, human health, climate resilience, and the economy. And so in order to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, we need governments to take the lead and come to grips with the scale of the funding and the investment that's required, and also to move away from subsidies that are actually harming nature. And we'll hear a lot more about that from particularly Paul a bit later on. We're going to hear from 4 experts today. It's a bit conceited, isn't it, calling myself for an expert? We're going to hear from 3 experts and me today about how much money is actually needed to halt nature loss and to recover threatened species, culturally significant plants and animals and ecosystems in this country. We'll also look at how that compares, the funding that we need compares to current levels of government investment across national and state, and the activities that they're doing that actually harm nature in terms of harmful subsidies. We'll then go into a Q&A at the end, so please put your questions in Q&A. Start now if you've got a question about what's happened to Brendan's hair today, or what's he got in the background there. Hopefully it's some wildlife and you won't see my cat. But yeah, let me start by introducing Mai Nguyen. Mai is the engagement manager at Cyan Ventures. Is an economist and strategic advisor with a decade of experience shaping public policy and driving industry development to support economic transformation. Her work sits at the intersection of policies, markets, and capital. So I'm super excited to hand over to you now, Mai, and take us through your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. In today's conversation, I'm super excited to share with you the recent projects that I had a pleasure to complete with ALCA, the Australian Land Conservation Association. And before I start, I would like to express my deep gratitude to a few people who may be on this call today. That is Liz Ashby from the Biodiversity Council, Paul Elton, who will be presenting later today, as well as James Josias and Jason from the Pew Trust. And together they gave us a lot of guidance and directions and support in helping form this tool that we call the Nature Spend Tracker. So why develop a Nature Spend Tracker? Until today, Australia doesn't have a tool to track how much we spend, by whom, or what outcome. We don't know what we are spending on nature, and therefore we don't have a baseline to understand the scale of our current investment or the scale of our underinvestment. The Nature Spend Tracker is intended as a tool to monitor how much Australia is spending on nature. One thing that we are very cognizant when developing this tool is that there are a range of different definitions of what could constitute a spend on nature. And to that extent, we want to support everyone to be able to make their own decisions. And we have published the reports that outline our result of this work, as well as the Excel, so you can actually see what spend has been included or not been included in our tracker. It's on our website, so please check that out if you are interested. So what did we find? In 2025, Australia spent approximately $1.5 billion to protect, restore, and manage nature. And these figures capture the expenditure across public, private, philanthropic sectors, focusing on activities that directly on the ground activities that have direct benefit, biodiversity benefits. In developing this tracker, we are very cognizant that there are activities that benefit nature. For example, environmental regulation, very important. Climate change mitigation, very important. Also, a range of activities under the agricultural portfolio across state departments, also very important to control invasive species and very important to protect biodiversity. We have not included those expenses because we want the focus of our tracker to focus on biodiversity, spending that aim to increase biodiversity. Where does that spending come from? Today, the majority of Australia's spend on nature comes from the public sector. So governments contribute about $1.3 billion out of a $1.5 billion spent annually. So this is significant. Philanthropy contribute about $250 million of the spend, and this hasn't changed much since 2023. We try to measure private sector spend, and we had a lot of challenges in identifying how much the private sector is currently spending on nature. This is because today there's still no existing developed framework to measure that is consistently applied across private sector in their reporting to report on how much they are spending on nature. So it's very unclear to us at this stage because of the data challenge how much the private sector is spending. But we know that through discussions, there's about $273,000 being spent on environmental planting acres that has some biodiversity co-benefits. Deep diving into the public sector spend, here on this chart is what the federal government is spending at the federal level. What we've seen is that just 5 programs account for 91% of the federal government spending on nature. And these 5 programs are the Natural Heritage Trust, Indigenous Ranger Program, the Reef Trust Program, and Saving Native Species. And here I want to highlight that for some of these programs, for example, the Reef Trust Program, for example, the Saving Native Species funding has only been committed to the end of this year. So if the funding is not continue, there will be a significant impact on spending on nature overall. State and territory spendings are also as equally important as federal spending, although we have real challenge estimating how much state spending given the aggregated reporting nature of the data. And we could discuss that more in the Q&A sessions if you are interested. Overall, what we are finding is that Australia is not spending enough. And there is an argument for the federal government to increase spending. Here, if we compare to other countries relative to the size of their landmass, some countries in Europe spend up to 200 times more than Australia on nature, meaning that even though governments contribute to the majority spend in Australia today, there's still a case to increase more federal government spending. For those slides, we did some estimate about the contribution of nature to our economy. And what we found is that nature really underpins our economy. It provides ecosystem service, for example, for the provision of food, the provision of water, the provision of amenities that underpin our agriculture, our water sector, and our tourism sector. And if we add all of the contribution of all these sectors to our economy, we estimate that nature actually contribute $138 billion to our economy. And so I think in a Q&A, someone asked a question about the impact of nature. How do you advocate for nature in engaging with the governments? This is because nature is actually underpin our economy, and if we underinvest in our economy, that would have a economic consequences on our broader economy, and that's how we would put it. And we also look into the impact on jobs and social value too. And it's very interesting to see that in some regions, especially in regional Australia, up to 1 in 5 jobs are jobs in industries dependent on nature. So that is huge.
Thanks so much, Mai. That's fabulous insight, and what an impressive project. And so, yeah, hats off to Alka and all of the collaborators there for getting that initiative off the ground. All right, now I'm excited to introduce John Hoggets, who's been working in the natural resource management sector of Northern and Central Australia for over a decade. He's been working with the Indigenous Desert Alliance since 2021. Prior to IDA, John worked with the Angus Downs Indigenous Protected Area as a coordinator before taking a role with the NT communities of Kintor, Utopia and Apatula. You can correct my pronunciations in a minute, John, if you like, in establishing ranger programs in those areas. So super excited to hear from John today. Take it away, John.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and hello to everybody. So yes, my name is John Hoggets. I'm here on behalf of the Indigenous Desert Alliance, or IDA, to talk about the need for better funding to support Indigenous-led management of desert country. So we are an Indigenous-controlled, member-based organisation that exists to keep the desert connected. We work with Indigenous ranger groups across Australia's desert region to connect ranger teams to strengthen shared capability and support Indigenous people to care for desert country at a scale that matches the landscape itself. Our role is not to replace local decision making, but to amplify the collective voice of desert rangers and traditional owners. Everything we do is grounded in one core principle. When Indigenous people are properly resourced to care for country, the benefits flow to everyone, to culture, to biodiversity, to climate resilience and to remote communities. So the question we're focusing on today is not whether Indigenous-led desert management works, since it clearly does, but whether the current funding models are fit for sustaining it over the long term. So for a bit of context, Australia's deserts cover around 1/3 of the continent. They're home to more than 30 Indigenous languages, iconic landscapes, globally significant biodiversity, and dozens of remote Indigenous communities that have remained connected to country for millennia. Indigenous land management is central to caring for this country. Across the desert, Indigenous rangers are managing approximately 1.5 million square kilometres, often in some of the most remote and fire-prone landscapes on Earth. There are now 28 Indigenous protected areas, or IPAs, in the desert, and that represents half of Australia's progress towards protecting 30% of land by 2030. Indigenous ranger programs are a national success story, but the scale, remoteness and complexity of desert management demands long-term, coordinated funding. Most funding mechanisms remain short-term, programs are specific and fragmented, even though desert systems and Indigenous governance systems operate over decades and not funding cycles. So I'll touch upon 4 key themes for which this is prescient. So first up, Right Way Desert Fire. It's one of the most critical Indigenous-led land management programs in the country, and it's actually the largest Indigenous-led cultural burning program in the world. For thousands of years, people were using fire to manage and care for country. When that burning stopped, deserts became vulnerable to large, hot, destructive wildfires. Right-way fire restores traditional owner-led fire regimes, small strategic burns that create healthy mosaics across the landscape, and this protects threatened and significant species, cultural sites, carbon stores, and remote community infrastructure. Not only is it providing these benefits, but it also has huge positive impacts on disaster management, helping to prevent those larger, hotter, and more destructive wildfires, and in addition, it aids with the management of introduced species such as bufflegrass. Scale is enormous, as I mentioned, about 1.5 million square kilometres of fire-prone country, and these benefits are cumulative and fragile. Without consistent funding, decades of work can be lost in a single fire season. Indigenous people also hold deep cultural knowledge about desert plants and animals, and that knowledge is essential to reversing biodiversity decline. Since colonisation, 1/3 of desert mammals have been lost, largely due to unmanaged fire and feral predators. IDA's Significant Species Programme supports ranger teams to lead recovery work using two-way science guided by traditional owner priorities. Indigenous people hold deep cultural knowledge about these species, where they live, how they move, and how country needs to be managed to support them. The significant species work supported by IDA shows what's possible when Indigenous leadership, ranger efforts, and scientific collaboration are coordinated at scale. A major achievement is the Chakra, or the Great Desert Skink Recovery Plan. It's Australia's first Indigenous-led national recovery plan. Rangers across 3 states are now monitoring populations, managing fire, and trialling predator control. But species recovery doesn't align neatly with 3 or 4 year funding windows. Monitoring, population recovery, knowledge transfer, and ranger skill development requires long-term certainty. When funding lapses, the loss isn't just momentum, it's trust, continuity, and intergenerational knowledge pathways. Gender equality in desert land management is widely supported, but that cannot be achieved through frontline jobs alone. Desert women face interconnected barriers, including remoteness, limited access to training under recognition of women's land management roles, loss of elders' knowledge, as well as social barriers such as high rates of violence or caring responsibilities. Our experience shows that targeted, culturally safe support works, including women-only training, female trainers, leadership pathways, and opportunities for women rangers to learn from each other across the desert. Just the presence of female staff on country or in training programs can create the appropriate cultural settings for women to participate. This applied cultural knowledge must be accommodated into budget development to ensure that male and female staff are a must-to-have and not a nice-to-have. We're expanding this work through a Desert Women's Leadership Programme, supporting women from ranger roles into coordination, training, and advocacy. However, these approaches also require long-term investment in sector capability, not short-term pilot programs. Cultural knowledge loss is accelerating as elders age. Supporting women's leadership is not just a workforce issue, it's a knowledge continuity issue. And lastly, much of what determines the success of Indigenous land management happens behind the scenes. Ranger coordinators, trainers, and mentors are critical to safety, governance, reporting, cultural integrity, and ranger well-being. Yet these roles are often under-resourced or treated as auxiliary. Again, our experience through our internships and coordinator training shows that when people in these roles are well supported, ranger programs are stronger, safer, and more resilient. Short-term funding makes it difficult to build stable career pathways, retain skilled staff, or embed institutional knowledge, particularly in remote desert contexts where recruitment is already challenging. Our internship program introduces people to Indigenous land management through immersive learning. Demand is high, with over 100 applications each year for up to 8 places, and over half of our interns are still working in the sector. We're also piloting a ranger coordinator professional development course for those already working within the sector, filling a critical gap. The pilot filled in less than 2 days. Coordinators mentor rangers and manage safety, reporting, and logistics. When coordinators are supported, ranger programs thrive. Indigenous rangers are already delivering extraordinary outcomes across Australia's deserts for culture, biodiversity, climate resilience, and community well-being. What's missing is long-term, coordinated funding that matches the scale and importance of the work, including for the programs and themes I've mentioned. Currently, federal government support is split across agencies, with core ranger funding coming from the Indigenous Ranger Programme and overseen by NIAA, and IPA funding, which DQ manage. The funding for our fire programme comes from another bucket altogether, the Natural Heritage Trust, which May alluded to. And for many ranger teams, this fractured funding results in an overburden of reporting and grant management that can expire before the next funding round is open, and results in loss of skilled staff and organisational knowledge, let alone the momentum. The value of Indigenous land management is beyond reproach, and therefore the challenge ahead is not improving its value, but in sustaining the effort. Desert ecosystems, Indigenous governance systems, and cultural knowledge systems all operate over long-term horizons. Short-term fragmented funding undermines exactly the coordination, learning, and trust that makes these programs effective. Long-term investment enables ecological processes to function properly, knowledge to be passed on, retention of skilled staff, ranger programs to mature and stabilise, and conservation outcomes to scale across boundaries. If we're serious about caring for 1/3 of Australia, we need funding models that reflect how deserts and Indigenous systems actually work. These are not new ideas, they are proven Indigenous-led solutions. With the right support, desert rangers will continue caring for country in ways that benefit all Australians now and for generations to come. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview of a critical issue, and so interesting to hear your take on the, I guess, the auxiliary benefits of that funding that comes into those places. So I'm sorry you can't hear that applause, but I can see plenty of it rising up out of the bubbles there. Brilliant. Okay, so next up we have Paul Elton. Paul is a research fellow at the ANU and is a non-executive director and advisor on nature conservation and climate action. Has a really long history. Sorry, not that long, Paul. It makes you sound old, doesn't it? It has an esteemed history in environmental policy in this country. His current research focuses on funding and reform pathways to transformative delivery of the global biodiversity framework in Australia. So really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Paul. Take it away.
Thanks, Brendan, and hello to everybody online. So yeah, what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is look at what the biodiversity funding picture reveals, because I think the financing of biodiversity policy tells a story that's perhaps confronting, but maybe also a bit reassuring. I'm going to share findings from two of my recent PhD studies, one published on how much money the Australian government spends on undermining nature, and one under peer review on how much it would cost governments to deliver the GBF in Australia. And when you put those two numbers side by side, the picture is either damning or encouraging, or maybe both. I'll let you decide. So quickly, what is the Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF? The GBF is the international community's latest response to the biodiversity crisis, adopted in Montreal in 2022. The GBF matters enormously for Australia in particular. We're one of only 17 megadiverse nations on Earth, and one of only 2 of those that are both wealthy and megadiverse, holding around 7.8% of the world's biodiversity, much of it found nowhere else on Earth. And yet our own State of the Environment reporting tells us we're going backwards on most indicators. That combination, exceptional biodiversity, exceptional responsibility, and a deteriorating trajectory, is what makes Australia's response to the GBF so consequential, in my view. As I'm sure many of you would know, the GBF isn't the first attempt to address the biodiversity crisis. The Aichi targets set 20 goals to be met by 2020, but none were fully achieved. So if you like, the GBF is in effect the world saying we failed and we need to try again, this time perhaps with greater ambition and accountability. Its language reflects that shift, calling for urgent and transformative action. So this is how I categorise the GBF's 23 targets. The ones that matter most, I think, for government budgets are the biodiversity conservation targets in the centre, those dealing with restoring degraded ecosystems, protected areas, preventing extinctions, and managing invasive species. My research supports a conclusion that these targets require direct public investment at scale, and they dominate the cost estimates you'll see shortly. The threat mitigation targets on the right are primarily, I think, about regulation and reform, and I'd argue that these costs should fall predominantly on the private sector, not on government budgets. So, given this framework, the obvious questions, I think, become what are governments currently spending that actively undermines nature, and what would it actually cost to do it right? And these are the two questions my recent studies set out to answer. So unfortunately, in relation to the topic of biodiversity harmful subsidies, there's a striking disconnect between what Australia has committed to do internationally and what it's done or not done domestically. Following commitments made under the 2010 Aichi targets to eliminate or reform harmful subsidies, Australia took no substantive action. Now, under GBF Target 18, we've signed up to a renewed and stronger global commitment. Target 18 requires governments to identify subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity by 2025. That deadline has already passed. and to reduce them by at least 500 billion US per year globally by 2030. But yet again, we've seen no real action in Australia. There's no relevant commitment in Australia's latest strategy for nature, and we've seen no comprehensive official national assessment of harmful subsidies. And that's the fundamental problem this study, published in February, sought to address. Until this research, we had no idea how much Australia may have been spending on subsidies that harm biodiversity. And this is what we found: at least 26.3 billion per year in identified biodiversity harmful subsidies from the Australian government alone. That's about 1.1% of Australia's GDP. To put that in perspective, both the Biodiversity Council and ALCA, as May has already shown, have estimated that the Australian government is spending less than $1 billion a year on biodiversity conservation. So for every dollar protecting biodiversity federally, there's more than $25 actively undermining it. The biggest subsidies by value are fossil fuel subsidies, particularly the fuel tax credit scheme at around $8 billion a year and growing unsustainably from a fiscal perspective, and transport infrastructure at $8.5 billion. Our experts from the Biodiversity Council ranked fossil fuel subsidies as highly harmful. They drive climate change, which compounds every other threat to biodiversity. But agriculture, forestry and fisheries subsidies were also ranked as highly harmful. They directly encourage habitat loss, still the #1 threat to biodiversity in Australia. And this estimate is almost certainly an undercount. We only looked at Commonwealth government subsidies, and their data was very opaque. We excluded state and territory subsidies, and we excluded implicit subsidies or unpriced externalities. The real figure is therefore likely much higher. Global studies suggest that unpriced externalities or implicit subsidies may be an order of magnitude larger than explicit subsidies, suggesting the true cost of these subsidies to nature and the economy is actually enormous. So in response to this research, the Biodiversity Council has called on the Australian government to task the Productivity Commission with conducting an independent and transparent national assessment of biodiversity harmful subsidies, and to make recommendations on options to reform or repurpose such subsidies. So that's what we're spending to harm nature, in summary. The obvious next question is, what would it cost to protect and conserve it? The second study, currently under peer review, is the first, I think, comprehensive national cost estimate for implementing the GBF in Australia. I can describe the methods I used for what was actually an enormous amount of work in questions later if you wish. Our estimate is governments need to be spending about $28.5 billion per year over the period from 2025 to 2050, and that's about 1.2% of Australia's GDP. And in my opinion, not for something optional, but to secure the natural systems that the entire economy depends upon. The 4 targets you see here on restoration, protection, species recovery, and invasive species together account for about 92% of the total cost estimate. But the footnote here makes an important point that this estimate isn't just costing those 4 targets. The estimate covers all government costs to implement all 23 GBF targets across all 3 GBF ecosystem realms, including implementing the GBF's enabling targets and to bring about the reforms to address the threat mitigation targets. I should also mention this estimate is the total government should be spending, not taking into account the existing spending that May has already talked about. So you can see roughly existing funding needs to be increased by about an order of magnitude and then double it, and then you'd be about right. I should also mention that this estimate doesn't include private sector costs for threat mitigation, because I argue those costs should be borne by the entities doing the harm through compliance with reformed regulations. It is, of course, open to governments to also consider structural adjustment assistance, but I didn't account for that in this estimate. The implications of this study are clear. To meet GBF Target 19, which calls for a major uplift in biodiversity funding, Australian governments need to make urgent commitments to scale up funding public investment in conservation and establish new intergovernmental arrangements to align priorities, to enable reforms and share funding responsibilities fairly between the Commonwealth and the states and territories. Now, I'm hoping you might find this slide both a bit confronting, but also perhaps a bit reassuring. So as I've already demonstrated, what we're spending to harm nature, at least 26.3 billion, what it would cost to adequately conserve nature, about 28.5 billion. Is 28.5 billion per annum a big ask? I guess so, yes. But I'd ask you to consider how much we spend on our pets as a comparator. Now, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't spend money on our pets. I do, and I believe Brendan does as well. But the comparison, though, does force a question, I think, about priorities. As a society, we're willing to spend 33 billion a year on animals we've chosen to live with, while spending less than 1 billion federally on the native species and ecosystems that underpin our economy, our water supplies, our agriculture, our livability, and our climate resilience and everything else. The World Economic Forum estimates that more than half of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. I would argue it's more like 100%, as you cannot have, in my opinion, a society and an economy without a healthy and functioning environment. So when I say 1%, 1.2% of GDP, that's 1.2% to secure the natural systems that the other 98.8% of our economy depends on. Put that way, it seems not just affordable, but essential. So we should be able to find a way to spend 28.5 billion per annum on biodiversity conservation. And to circle back, I also just want to emphasise that we need not only to address GBF Target 19 by significantly increasing spending on positive biodiversity conservation action, but we must also address Target 18 by reforming to reduce the negative impacts of harmful subsidies. If we don't do both, we would just end up spinning in the sand. So what does this all mean for policy? Well, here are my 3 key takeaways. First, subsidy reform offers a potential double dividend, and I think this is a critical point. There is money already in the system. At least 26 billion is already being spent. It's just flowing in the wrong direction. Reforming harmful subsidies would simultaneously reduce harm to biodiversity, but also free up fiscal resources that could be redirected to positive conservation action. You don't necessarily need to find new money. You could instead stop spending existing money or making the problem worse. So now in practice, it's more complicated than that because some of these subsidies are indirect. They're tax concessions rather than direct spending, and some serve other policy objectives. But the broad principle holds, and I can elaborate on this in questions if you wish. Second, I think federal coordination and cost sharing are essential. This is a core structural challenge. The Commonwealth Government signed the GBF and it therefore has lead responsibility for implementation. And the Commonwealth Government also raises 83% of total national tax revenue. But the states and territories manage most of the land, run most of the protected areas, and are responsible for most of the on-ground implementation. So there's therefore obviously a massive fiscal capacity mismatch. In health and education, we've built sophisticated intergovernmental funding agreements to deal with exactly this problem. So for biodiversity, nothing currently equivalent exists. And in my ongoing research, I'm developing a practical basis for federal cost-sharing arrangements, which I hope to publish later this year. My third and final takeaway, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable, is that political will is currently undermined, I think, by weak accountability and low public awareness. Australia has now submitted 7 national reports to the CBD, but if you compare them with our own independent State of the Environment reporting, the picture they paint of progress is implausibly optimistic. And on that, I'd refer you to a critique I co-authored with Hugh Possingham in The Conversation recently. There's no binding consequence for that lack of accountability. The CBD relies entirely on reputational pressure, and that pressure is weak if reports receive little domestic or international scrutiny. Meanwhile, biodiversity simply hasn't yet achieved the community salience that climate change has. People feel a heat wave or see the impacts of increasingly extreme natural disasters. Most don't see or feel a species going extinct in the same immediate way. So together, those two things keep the political cost of inaction low. The encouraging part, though, is that stronger accountability doesn't require renegotiating international treaties. Better domestic monitoring, such as the Nature Spend Tracker, clearer public reporting, and holding governments to the commitments they've already made. These are entirely within reach. So I think raising the political cost of inaction is one of the most important things that all of us, researchers, advocates, organisations like the Biodiversity Council and ALCA can all do. So look, that's it from me. I'll leave that slide up for a sec. I'm happy after we've all spoken to answer any questions that any of you may have. Thanks. Thanks, Brandon. Back to you.
Thank you, Paul. Fantastic, really fantastic summary. And of course, the slides will be available, I think, after, so that people can take away and pore over those words in their own time. Okay, thanks. That was a fantastic spin across the big picture around nature and funding and what those opportunities are. Right now, I'm going to introduce an opinionated middle-aged academic. And as I've already introduced myself, I don't have to go back over that ground, who's going to talk about a little more narrowly around the implications of underspend for threatened species. And this is something that a number of us have been working on for a few years. Our numbers that we've pulled together on threatened species have found their way into various other reports and work, including a previous Cyan Ventures report and the work of Paul and others. And so if you're wondering why the numbers look a bit different to the numbers that we've heard from Mai and from Paul, it's because I'm talking about a slightly narrower scope here of threatened species. Right, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. This is our current national expenditure on the targeted Saving Native Species program of the Commonwealth. And you can see in the blue bars, these were forecast or committed spends, and in the orange bars, these were actual spends up to the end of 2026. Well, we haven't quite got there yet through the end of 26, but I think there's a couple of things to note here. We're talking about the very peak promised expenditure under this Commonwealth Government program to protect our 2,000 odd native threatened species was $80 million in 1 year, which is frankly chicken feed compared to the numbers that we've been hearing about. And I invite you to just do a tiny little bit of internal arithmetic to think through how this relates as a order of magnitude of the numbers we've been hearing about that are needed in the order of $25 billion a year to look after our nature as a whole. So the threatened species picture at the moment is a pretty small portion, and yet we're talking about more than 2,000 nationally listed threatened species. If you include state listed threatened species, the number goes up to sort of 4,000 or 5,000 across all of the states. We're talking about a really critical part of our national identity, our cultural heritage, and the legacy that we pass on to future generations in terms of what they can see of our magnificent animals and plants and ecosystems in this country. And of course, as we all know, we are losing biodiversity at the highest rate of any developed nation, and we're losing species, and we have a linear upward trajectory of species loss even since the introduction of our EPBC Act, our Endangered Species Conservation Act, back in 1999. So looking at this graph, you might notice that there's no figures in 2026-27, financial year 27-28 or 28-29. That's because this program is not currently assured beyond the end of 2026. So our Saving Native Species program that allocates funding to around 6 or 7% of our listed threatened species has no guarantee after the end of the next financial year. This should be a bit of a call to action. We're hearing from experts in this call telling us how much more funding we need, and what we've got at the moment is a promise of approximately zero funding into this program after 2026, something to be a bit concerned about. What do we think we actually need compared to what we have actually seen there in terms of total expenditure on threatened species, targeted expenditure on threatened species from the Commonwealth? So we did a study, it's getting a bit old now, that we published a couple of years ago that looked across all of the different threatened species that we have in this country and how our spending compares to equivalent groups of species in the US. So, and the US has quite a good track record, possibly not so good this year, but in the past it's had quite a good track record of expenditure on protecting its endangered species. It has approximately the same number of endangered species as we have, a few fewer, and they spend the equivalent of around to 3 billion Australian dollars a year on looking after those threatened species. So we said, well, per species in mammals, fish, plants, what do we expect we would need to spend to protect our threatened species based on those US numbers, where they've actually delisted a whole bunch of threatened species that have actually been recovered. So their programs seem to generally work. And we found that we would need around $2 billion a year here in Australia to try and prevent any further extinctions of our amazing animals and plants in this country. That was a terrestrial estimate. So at the moment that, oh, no point pressing that. I'm just so used to forwarding my own slides from PowerPoint. At the moment, that number is our sort of best estimate for threatened species terrestrially. We then extended this study in collaboration with the Australian Marine Conservation Society last year, and we actually found that we also need to spend around $340 million a year on conserving marine threatened species in this country. So, you know, around a quarter of the terrestrial spend, just because there's far fewer marine species actually listed under our EPBC Act compared with the terrestrial species. So we're looking now at around, you know, combining marine and terrestrial, around $2.4 billion a year of threatened species expenditure. We suggest, and this work has then been picked up into the Wentworth Group blueprint to repair Australia's nature landscapes. They've updated these figures a little bit since our study. Biodiversity, we need this 1% of national budget per year spent on nature, around $7 billion. This was before Paul released his much more comprehensive analysis of what we would need to spend to meet our global biodiversity framework targets, which is a step up. It's not just keeping species in the game, it's actually recovering and restoring species and degraded habitats. That number of 1% for nature, threatened species expenditure has been picked up by some political parties, but quite frankly, not nearly enough. Fortunately, we already know, thanks to Paul's articulate presentation, where we could find this money. Our $7 billion a year for preventing further extinctions is nothing compared to the $25 billion a year we spend on harmful subsidies, or, as he points out, the $35 billion a year approximately we spend on Diamante collars and hairdry treatments for our cats and our dogs. So we're rich enough as a nation to find this money to save our threatened species. If you don't find that argument compelling, and quite frankly, so far we haven't had a lot of luck getting traction with the major parties around this 1% for nature, then maybe we need to think about ourselves a bit more. And there's some fantastic studies out there, including this study by the Australian Local Government Association, that looked at what the benefit is, the multiplicative benefit is of spending on nature. And they did a bunch of surveys across hundreds of councils, but then also looked at some detailed economic analysis in a few councils, looking at case studies. And they basically found that the leverage of spending $1 on the environment is $3.1 return back to the people in that community, in those local governments. And they were looking at various examples, including urban cooling in Darwin, flood management in the Lockyer Valley, and others. I really encourage you to have a look at this excellent report to have some numbers in your back pocket when you're talking about the value of spending on nature for people. Another fantastic study recently released by Jim Radford and colleagues looks at how much benefit we actually get from in farms for investing in natural capital on farms. And they found a really stark increase in farm profitability as natural capital increases on farms. This is a study across over 114 farms across Australia. Fantastic study, very hard-nosed economic analysis that shows that natural capital investment really improves profitability on farms. So I've been wondering, well, how can we portray these these amazing benefits to local communities nationally of hitting our 30 by 2030 targets for protecting our biodiversity and restoring on degraded land. So this is targets 2 and 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And to be honest, I guess this is not something that has really been done. I actually don't know what the answer is. If I was given the opportunity to have a yarn to this guy in the halls of Parliament, I actually don't know what those multipliers are. What is the benefit in financial terms, in terms of jobs, in terms of return to local community, of us investing in restoration, feral animal control, cultural burning, all of those things? I think we need to quantify these numbers to create a better argument for our political leaders. Fortunately, the public do seem to be on our side. The Biodiversity Council annual Nature Concerns Survey, Biodiversity Concerns Survey, most people, 75% of people, already think we're spending more than 1% of our budget on nature, not the 0.1% that we are spending. And 95% of people think this is a very good idea. So this is something heartening, I guess, from the Biodiversity Concerns Survey to help us convince our politicians that actually this is something that the public support. All right, that's enough for me. Hopefully that's enough, a little bit of a provocation, I guess, to our question, our Q and answer session that we have now. So I am just going to expertly navigate to our Q&A panel and start hearing from some of the most upvoted questions. All right, I knew we were going to see it, but needless to say, the top voted question is around the nature repair market. From Daniel, thank you. I imagine if we raise this with current governments, their new nature repair market will be raised as a market-led solution for improving biodiversity. Why would this solution fall short compared with the government directly funding these projects themselves? I'm going to go to Paul because I know you've thought a bit about this already and have a bit of a history with such things, Paul, for the first answer.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Brandon. Look, it's a really interesting question. I think I'm a little bit concerned about the nature repair market and how much it will actually achieve. I think it's still perhaps a little bit confused as well as to whether it's being built as a compliance market or a voluntary market. So I think my view on this, and I didn't get to touch on this in my presentation earlier about the cost estimate, is that I think private funding, philanthropic funding, and environmental markets can all play a role, but my research is suggesting that that will be insufficient to do the heavy lifting that we need overall. So it can play a complementary supporting role. So you may get, on the voluntary side of the market, you may get, some investment flowing from philanthropists, from philanthropic type contributions from the private sector that may make a contribution, particularly towards GBF Target 2 on restoration. The compliance side will only ever give you at best a no net loss outcome, maybe a moderate net gain outcome if the net gain concepts get any traction with integrity. So they're not really adding to addressing the legacy of 200 years of degradation of our environment. So that's my quick, I could go on about this for 15 minutes or longer, but
Thanks, Paul.
Quick response.
No, appreciate it. And I knew that was a danger because you know so much about this topic, but thank you. That's excellent. Look, I'm going to also ask John, and I will come to you, Mai, because you're an economist, so you probably should have the final word on this. But John, can you comment on that? Has there been much interest from the private sector, maybe through markets or maybe through other means, in investing in ranger programs, working on country, that sort of thing? Are you seeing that, or are we still really heavily reliant on government spend?
I mean, the core programmatic funding is still heavily reliant on government spend, but we do, certainly within IDA, see a lot of philanthropic support for that sort of value added, I suppose we'll call it. And, it's certainly a sector that we're continuing to engage with and look at strengthening relationships. We're looking outside of our traditional philanthropic partners as well to sort of look at new revenue streams or new income streams from partners, which is all part of our growth as well. Like IDA has grown significantly over the last sort of 3-4 years, where we've kind of quadrupled in numbers. And so we've sort of gone from a very insular look, sort sort of viewpoint and working in strengthening the network and working with our members and working with ranger teams and the existing funding that's coming in. And obviously now we're getting funded at that more landscape scale and where there is connectivity, cross-jurisdictional, large-scale projects, and certainly philanthropics are looking more into that space. They're seeing a lot of wins there. So it is a growing part, and I think it's one we can't. The Indigenous land management sector is in a desert context needs additional investment, whether that be through longevity of government funding and commitment, or whether it comes through philanthropy, is still to be determined. And also the nature repair market, is that third big question of what does that look like in the desert context as well. And IDA, we've been working establishing a desert habitat method to sort of at least provide opportunities where ranger teams can look at other opportunities. So we won't be directly, giving an opinion one way or the other, but at least creating tools that enable ranger teams to potentially access the nature repair market. But again, that is still very much limited to its geographic scope at the moment. It's not desert wide.
Yeah, and we probably need some actual buyers who aren't just looking to satisfy regulatory offset burden, which is probably the main concern, isn't it? Who's going to buy? Mai, did you want to add to that, or should we?
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I probably want to show some example from historical experience in other sectors to draw parallel. So first is on climate mitigation finance. And what we see in our research is that the increase in climate mitigation finance recently has been driven by increase in private investment. So that is to say that the step up in funding for nature can come from private sector investment. The second thing to say is that for the nature repair market, the concern currently is rightfully so, is that where the demand would come from. And currently it is because the demand still come from voluntary demand. And this is challenging to scale up demand. And from my work in other sectors that also currently rely on voluntary demand, they have been pushed to increase regulations, to push regulation in shaping the regulatory framework so that investment in nature or in climate positive projects in the other sectors I work on become part of day-to-day business operations rather than voluntary demand from business. So maybe this is where I could draw the parallel to the nature repair market here.
Thanks, Mai. Coming back to advocating for these good ideas, a question there directed at Paul. How are these ideas around subsidies and around what we need being communicated to government? Who sits down with the high-level decision makers to explain the problems and hear about the solutions?
Yeah, look, I already posted an answer online there, but just to reiterate very quickly, I'm still working closely with the Biodiversity Council to promote this research, particularly the research on harmful subsidies, which is out there now. We had an active media campaign initially, and we did get some coverage. And we've also been getting in the door with ministers and MPs to brief them on the topic, and to basically put forward our ask for a productivity commission inquiry. We're yet to see whether we'll get traction with that, but we can only try.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Just looking down through the votes, one here from Stephen. What are the low-hanging fruit that you'd recommend government spend on? And is there a way for government to value the return on investment? I want to start with you, John.
I mean, I think committing to the significant species or saving a significant species fund would be a quick one. Like I said, the Great Desert Skink, the first Indigenous-led recovery program, and has seen, we've seen the scope and the range of the Great Desert Skink grow. It continues to be almost entirely on Indigenous land, and you kind of add that to the bilby and the night parrot and these other significant species that are requiring recovery plans up and coming. So I think that's one that can deliver not necessarily quick wins as such, but engage, cross-jurisdictional, multiple members and range teams, huge areas of land, and critical and significant species, not only culturally, but threatened species to Australia's biodiversity as well.
All right, I'm going to ask a harder question. It's got a lot of votes here. I'm going to have to start with you again, Paul, and then we'll go to you, Mai, and then we're going to have to finish up. Agree with everything you said, though one part I often find missing is the purpose of harmful subsidies. So they're not just purely political corruption. We know that, but what happens if we get rid of them?
Yeah. Look, it's a good point. Many of these subsidies have been put in place historically to serve a particular policy objective, and the harm to biodiversity is effectively an unintended consequence most of the time. But so what we've done is an umbrella review. What we're saying is the Productivity Commission should, with all of its resources and access to government data, should do a much deeper dive into each subsidy that we've identified and any others that would fall into this category. The questions they should be asking are, what were the original policy objectives? Are those policy objectives still relevant today? Can those policy objectives be achieved in other ways that are not harmful to biodiversity? And one of the things we highlighted in the research is an example from Italy where they specifically commissioned an interministerial commission or something to specifically look at what they called intrasectoral repurposing. So taking subsidies, say, in agriculture that are causing harm, keeping an equivalent value of subsidies in that sector, but directing that money to things that are actually biodiversity positive. So there's lots of different ways you can unpack this. And we're not for one moment suggesting that we're going to be able to get all of this 26 billion back out of harmful subsidies and into positive conservation action. But there's still a massive opportunity to look at that intrasectoral repurposing. And some of these subsidies may no longer be required. The policy objectives may have gone away. The other reality is that many of them are market distorting. Many of the benefits flow to typically higher income earners, typically to men. There's a gender problem as well. So, I think and they just sit there and no one ever goes back and look at them again. So I think, there is a really compelling case for these to be subject to periodic review, including in relation to the issue of harm to nature.
Great, thanks, Paul. I'm going to call your call to action then, no more harmful subsidies to rich white men. And I'm going to go to Mai and John for a quick 10-second call to action before we draw a line under this. Thank you. Mai.
Absolutely concur. Absolutely concur with Paul. I would say we need to compare the purpose and the benefit of the spend today, those subsidies today, with what could be spent on if we were to invest that in nature projects. Yeah.
Great. John, give us your elevator pitch to the Prime Minister.
Oh, blimey. I don't know if we can do that in 10 seconds or off the bat, but no, just to continue that, Indigenous land managers have been working for 50,000 years. In the current state, there needs to be considered and meaningful investment to continue that work. People need country and country needs people.
I think that's a great last word. Thank you very much. I think a great way to finish. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope a huge crowd. I saw 370 people there at one point, or at least I hope most of you were people and not just AI bots. Thank you so much to Liam and Yana for organising this. They're always fun events, and I hope you enjoyed it.